Okay, situating us, it is currently 23rd of June 2025, which is some time since I recorded about Dream 5 on page 128 of Dreams. We're going to be looking at Dream 6 and onwards, but this is after I have published commentaries on zombies in Western culture and the introduction to Jung's Red Book, both of which have clarified what I've been working towards and understanding in Jung and in Viveki and how to contribute um, to working towards a solution to the situation in which we're embedded. And I continue to believe that, yeah, exploring Jung in more depth is helpful for that. Um, so we're essentially going to go right into it from page 128 on Dream 6. Just notably on Dream 5, I didn't comment about standing rooted to the ground like a tree. Obviously, I made the connection last time that it was by virtue, there's a connection between one's shadow and one's individuality or one's autonomy. The link to that is that the Jung's quote on page 126, the experience of the unconscious is a personal secret, communicable only to very few, and that with difficulty, hence the isolating effect we noted above. So the thing about personal secrets is that they they're shameful and they, in a way, define one's individuality. So there's a way that I think ego identity originates in childhood, like the I am sense. I am this, I am that, usually originates with core wounds. I am unlovable, I am unworthy, something like that. And I think in this way that the shadow, as a symbol of um, core wounds, self-determination, ego identity, as connected with the symbol of the triangle and the solar plexus chakra, this sort of forms the basis of our ego strength because there's a sort of audaciousness or heroic quality which is um, concomitant upon the realization of that uh, of those qualities of oneself. And I think that wound, like if to quote Rumi, the wound is the place where the light enters you. It's by virtue of the aperture of that original wound that one establishes an initial relationship with the ultimate or divine. And that means that the existence of personal secrets as an expression of that place of uh, deep personhood from which one comes um, has a double meaning in the sense that it can be extremely cathartic to share with others um, those sort of qualities about oneself, but that can also uh, violate their quality of protecting one's individuality. Um, so the function of the snake in drawing the spellbinding circle is to um, define one's individuality apart from the collectivity, whether that be conscious or unconscious. So there's a sense that the personal shadow um, functions as a kind of protective barrier against inundation. And that can be inundation from the collective unconscious or inundation by, in the sense of, I'm saying that the personal shadow is a sort of bastion of privacy, and that has a connection to divinity or transcendence in the sense that it is from out of that privacy that um, Jung says the unconscious is able to be met. And he's saying that on, yeah, page 128. Yeah, because it's by virtue of the snake um, and the qualities associated with the snake, as I've just described, that one succeeds in establishing a protected temenos, a taboo area, where he will be able to meet the unconscious. So it's from out of that taboo area, by which there what we mean by taboo is that there are boundaries. It's like we don't cross that part, right? It's from out of that isolation, um, like when one is lacking a personal connection to the divine, that isolation can be experienced as uncanny and even solipsistic and then nihilistic. But when one can has the means to recognize one's inherent um, the inherent correspondence between Atman and Brahman, the small self and the large self, then that isolation, so uncanny before, is now endowed with meaning and purpose, and thus robbed of its terrors. And so it's this the snake describing the circle around the dreamer who stands rooted to the ground like a tree. Well, rooted to the ground means rooted to the earth. So what roots us to the earth? It's our lower qualities. And this has a quality of grounding, while also um, it grounds us within our individuality. It grounds us within our limitations, within our finite nature, all that is associated with the earth. Um, and th those, in the same way that the roots of a tree allow that tree to then grow, that is in some sense, the function of the shadow. Okay, dream six, still on the same page. Yeah, so we talked about how the positive relationship with the shadow, which is demonstrated or exemplified by the snake describing that circle around the dreamer, um, reveals for the first time the anima or soul or daemon, if you prefer, um, who in some way is concealed behind the shadow until after the establishment of the relationship that I just described. So Dream 6 is a visual impression directly following upon 5, and it goes the veiled figure of a woman seated on a stair. Um, and I will read out Jung for the moment. Jung says the motif of the unknown woman, whose technical name is the anima, appears here for the first time. Like the throng of vague female forms in Dream 4, she is a personification of the animated psychic atmosphere. From now on, the figure of the unknown woman reappears in a great many of the dreams. Personification always indicates an autonomous activity of the unconscious. If some personal figure appears, we may be sure that the unconscious is beginning to grow active. The activity of such figures very often has an anticipatory character. Something that the dreamer himself will do later is now being done in advance. In this case, the allusion is to a stair, thus indicating an ascent or a descent. So about this, this is obviously in the context, like part of the reason for the significance of this analysis is that it is after Jung has um, sort of chosen not to publish the Red Book. He has recorded the revelations in the Red Book, but not chosen to publish them. This um, damages and ultimately corrupts his relationship with his own soul. And I'm not voicing that as a criticism of Jung. I'm making observations of what happened with Jung in his relationship with his soul. Um, the soul or anima, equivalent to the Socratic daemon, is a mediator toward God. So it, I guess this is a metaphysical statement, but yes, in the sense of Meister Eckhart, as I talked about in the fourth publication, gosh, commentary on zombies in Western culture, it is this is an elaboration of the Atman Brahman theme. It's by virtue of one's most intimate connection with one's own personhood that one in some way corresponds with divinity itself. And the soul or anima is a mediating figure in that relationship. Why is that important here? I guess I'm making an extended ongoing argument that Jung is referring to his own process just as much as he's referring to the process of the dreamer itself. Um, the activity of such figures very often has an anticipatory character. Something that the dreamer himself will do later is now being done in advance. I refrain from commenting on that further at this point because I don't want to pack too much into a single paragraph. Goes on, since the process running through dreams of this kind has an historical analogy in the rites of initiation, it may not be superfluous to draw attention to the important part which the Stairway of the Seven Planets played in these rites, as we know from Apuleius, among others. What's Jung talking about? So we've talked a bit about the hero's journey and how there is an ongoing process or journey through this series of dreams or ongoing journey through life, which Jung talks about as individuation, that the dreams represent. And um, the stages of progression through the dreams um, bear an analogy to traditional rites of initiation or initiation rituals that Jung is talking about. And it allows us to talk about the importance of the stair, which is from the dream. So Jung talks about it as indicating ascent or descent. It could also indicate sitting in the middle of the stair. Um, the importance of which is, I mean, yeah, the importance of that is in Qiddiya, which is found in four archetypes, Qiddiya as in from the Quran. In Jung's text, four archetypes talks about that. So it doesn't have to indicate ascent or descent. But in any case, Jung goes on, the initiations of late classical syncretism, already saturated with alchemy, were particularly concerned with the theme of ascent. I.e., sublimation. The ascent was often represented by a ladder, hence the burial gift in Egypt of a small ladder for the car of the dead. The idea of an ascent through the seven spheres of the planets symbolizes the return of the soul to the sun god from whom it originated, as we know, for instance, from Firmicus Maternus. Thus, the Isis mystery described by Apuleius culminated in what early medieval alchemy, going back to Alexandrian tradition as transmitted by the Arabs, called the solificatio, where the initiand was crowned as Helios. So this allows us to connect using this is using symbolic logic. So all the symbols are sort of being amplified to draw out their underlying historical meanings to some degree. And the stair, so the woman is associated with the stair. So the anima is associated with the stair in some way. What does the stair represent? What does the stair point to? And it points to the number seven. So there's going to be an ongoing theme of sort of ascending up ladders and down ladders. So there's a sort of opponent processing going up and down and up and down and up and down. That is progression in some way. Um, and seven is connected with that. Why? Yeah, because the ascent is often represented by a ladder, and that's from Egypt. And yeah, the idea of ascent through the seven spheres of the planets. And so seven is obviously connected with seven chakras, seven metals, seven planets. Um, so there's significance associated with the number. Mm, yeah, so the connection here is to Neopl Neoplatonic ascent. I've said Neoplatonic ascent via Orphic daimonism, Ficino's natural magic. Um, I'm taking that from chapter 7 of a book called DMT Entity Encounters, which talks about Neoplatonic ascent by Orphic daimonism. Basically, what it's talking about is that it's by establishing and developing a relationship with one's soul that one can make in what in Neoplatonic terms is a sort of anagogic ascent or spiritual development that sort of proceeds through different layers or levels of a spiritual hierarchy, and the number seven and the ladder and the ascent are all connected with that process. Importantly, the anima we're taking from Vervaeke here, from Corbin through Charles Stang. This is from Corbin would be episodes 48 and 9 of Awakening of the Meaning Crisis. The anima is essentially the divine double or the daemon. Socrates' daemon is an example where it's by, in some way, the soul or the anima is in some way what is most deeply personal about one, in some sense, and it's sort of by establishing and developing a relationship with that soul that um, one can be sort of drawn forward through transformative experience. So it's a kind of higher self, if you like, that allows one to, uh, in narrative terms, structure one's identity in terms of aspiration. So it's by like um, accessing that soul, anima, or divine double in transcendent states that one can then sort of imbibe or take on those qualities in one's limited mortal life. And this is a model of anagogic ascent, which is implied by the symbolism associated with the stairway and the veiled figure of the woman sitting on that stair. Yeah, importantly, the Isis mysteries lasted 2,000 years and then got taken up into the same symbolism. This is also obviously we know that the flow through from Egypt, which gets talked about later in this series. Um, the solificatio is an important thing to mention. Jung talks about that in Dream 7, though, so I'm going to read Dream 7 and move on. Importantly, it's a veiled figure of a woman, meaning the relationship with the woman has not been yet clarified or unveiled to the appropriate degree. Yeah, so there's a way that the anima mediates attunement to the truth, meaning truth is in numinous truth, so the really real. So the anima sort of mediates our relationship with the really real, where truth is disclosed by aletheia or unveiling, the Heideggerian word. And basically what that means is that, as in Dream 7, the visual impression, this is from page 131, the veiled woman uncovers her face. It shines like the sun. And so the soul, the veiled woman, reveals the truth. So the sun obviously is connected with, and the unveiling are also associated with illumination and enlightenment, as per the hat. So the hat and the sun are both different symbols of the self. And so they converge on what Jung calls the self. And so the solificatio is a kind of deification tradition. Yeah, deification tradition where the initiand, meaning the person that is being a subject in this ritual, was deified using sun symbolism. So a solification is like becoming like the sun. Um, and in the dream, it's to shine like the sun after being unveiled is a symbol of that um, ritual event. It means that the veiled woman is this kind of conveyor of illumination, truth, enlightenment, unveiling, aletheia, all of this. Importantly, we skipped the 10th footnote, which read that it's said by the pagans that the soul descends through the circle of the sun. And so there's an idea here. Obviously, this buys into crispation, reincarnation a little bit, but in terms of the, let's say, mythology of the soul, there's an idea that, especially from Jung, it's from the unconscious or the divine or from God. From that point of view, from the point of view of the divine, we appear as the soul. And so there's a way that the soul descends, or the divine double, this sacred second self, as Vervaeke calls it. Um, uh, our relationship with that figure gets us closer to divinity, and similarly, that divinity is sort of represented by the symbolism associated with the sun. So it would very much make sense for the pagans to say that the soul descends through the circle of the sun, in the sense that, as Eckhart said, God is born in the soul. if you imagine the soul as like a, or the divine double is like an aperture the um through which God is revealed, let's just say. What else does Jung say here? This process would seem to, yeah, the solidification is consummated on the person of the anima. And so the anima, the personal significance, the personal qualities of the anima, her personhood, um, is uh, divinized or made divine in the same way as the um, crowning ritual that's mentioned. The sol Meaning that the solidification, the shining like the sun, is consummated on the person of the anima. Um, it means that there's a connection between one's soul and one's personhood, which is important to establish because there's also a connection between one's personhood and divinity in the sense of Atman Brahman. So it's by moving further into one's own personhood or into one's own soul, if you like, that one can develop a relationship with Numinous. In that way, the one's personhood, as exemplified, let's say, in one soul, um, is a sort of defense against the overpowering nature of the Numinous. This process would seem to correspond to the illuminatio or enlightenment. This mystical idea contrasts strongly with the rational attitude of the conscious mind, which recognizes only intellectual enlightenment as the highest form of understanding and insight. Naturally, this attitude never reckons with the fact that scientific knowledge only satisfies the little tip of personality that is contemporaneous with ourselves, not the collective psyche that reaches back into the grey mists of antiquity and always requires special right if it is to be united with present-day consciousness. It's clear, therefore, that a lighting up of the unconscious is being prepared, which has far more the character of an illuminatio than a rational elucidation. The solidificatio is infinitely far removed from the conscious mind. It seems almost chimerical. Um, yeah, when we're talking about a sort of Jung's essentially saying that when we're talking about a sort of realization of one soul, or like a lighting up of consciousness that is occurring, a transmission from the divine in some way that is occurring through one's relationship with one soul, that is very much not a rational attitude. And in fact, the scientific consciousness is sort of going to be getting in the way of that. When we talk about soul, it's a quality that's associated with the deepest guts of who we are as persons and what it means to be alive. It's very much at an embodied level of transmissions, not coming from the rational mind. It's coming from much deeper than that. Yeah, solidification means sort of sun becoming as the sun, becoming like the sun, and sort of taking on the divine symbolism associated with the sun. Is there anything else here? I think we will move on to Dream 8. I guess just to mention about Jung in passing that um, as per sort of what happened with Jung and his own anima, his own soul, Jung's rational commentary, his knowledge, his scholarly persona, much like my own, I would say, are sort of very much getting in the way. So there's a we had earlier from Dream 4, first I must get away from father. And what is afforded by this getting away from that scientific rationalistic voice is firstly the snake describing the circle around the dreamer, but then the unveiling of the woman. And so the what is essentially being established here is that um, Jung's scientific personae is actually serving in the role of his shadow. And so there's a way that showing up as with a scholarly face, uh, much like my own. I'm not scholarly, but like to the degree that I'm like, it's not very intimate today because I feel like very heady and I'm using a lot of words that are maybe hard to follow. This is sort of getting in the way of uncovering the soul or making a more personal connection. And some of Jung's statements here can be taken as confession. Yeah, so because he says it's clear, therefore, that a lighting up of the unconscious has been prepared, which has far more the character of an illumination than a rational elucidation, which means all this rational elucidation is in some way getting in the way. This means that the anima figure I've written is a personification or representation of the unconscious and enlightenment by that unconscious, which we already talked about. So Dream 8, still on page 131, is a visual impression which reads a rainbow is to be used as a bridge. A rainbow meaning seven colors. So that's associated with the seven planets, seven metals, seven steps of the seven spheres of the planets, seven, yeah, steps on the ladder, let's say from earlier. Um, a rainbow is to be used as a bridge, but one must go under it and not over it. Whoever walks over it will fall and be killed. Yeah, so as Jung says, only the good gods can walk rainbow bridges in safety, as it like it from Asgard, for example. Um, Mere mortals fall and meet their death, for the rainbow is only a lovely semblance that spans the sky, and not a highway for human beings with bodies. They must pass under it. But water flows under bridges too, following its own gradient and seeking the lowest place. This hint will be confirmed later. Um, Basically, what this is saying is that um, the from Gnosticism, we sort of have this aspirational link to become as the gods are, to become like gods. And this visual impression, this dream, number 8, is sort of revealing that this attitude is going to be sort of getting in the way. So there's a sort of it's pushing back on the Luciferian hubris of the shadow and saying that um, we have um, a rainbow is to be used as a bridge, but one must go under it, not over it. So if one were to go over this rainbow bridge, the symptomatology would be it would be too high. There would be too much focus on ascent, not enough focus on descent. So too much transcendence, not enough limitation. Um, Too much, yeah, ascent and not descent. Um, Not enough humility, essentially, because we are not like the gods. Only the gods can walk rainbow bridges in safety. Yeah, so following in the sense that the soul is a psychopomp or a guide, the correct route through this ongoing dialogue with the unconscious, the way forwards on the hero's journey is to follow the soul under the bridge, and that would lead us away from the father, the rational spirit of science, which in this instance, as per Jung, is actually functioning as the shadow because he's a Gnostic. So the fatherly persona of the scholar that Jung is putting on is sort of in the place of the Gnostic demiurge. And it's by getting away from that attitude that one can follow the soul, listen to the soul. And the consequence is that we pass under the Rainbow Bridge, and there's a corrective, sorry, there's a connection where note that like when we in Dream 5 we talked about this circle being around the figure in the middle, and this is a sort of symbol associated like mandala symbolism associated with the self is this circle with a dot in the middle, and the rainbow is actually a symbol of the same. So a rainbow is actually a full circle, but we don't see half of it because it's covered by the earth. We only ever see half of a rainbow, the top half, the visible half, but it is actually an entire circle. And essentially what this is saying is that the symbolism of the right location, the right place to be, the right attitude, the right bearing, the right disposition, the right stance to take, these are all the same as in Dream 5. So the snake describes the circle around the dreamer, and this positioning was important to protect one from inundation by the unconscious. Dream 8 is saying the same thing, where to go over the bridge would take one sort of too far afield, too far away from one's proper place, which is to walk underneath the bridge. in the middle of the circle of the rainbow, which is also here, it's also a descent, meaning under the bridge is sort of where ogres hang out, the trolls under the bridge. So it's not going to be pretty to go under the bridge. Um, Says obviously Dal number 8 is relevant from water flows under bridges too. Dal number 8, I could get that for us. Can I? And Dal 8 goes, the highest form of goodness is like water. Water knows how to benefit all things without striving with them. It stays in places loathed by all men, therefore it comes near the Tao. I won't read the rest, but just to say that the virtue of water, as connected with Taoism, is to be connected with the earth, connected with everything lowly and sort of inconspicuous, rather than ascending to a pretty rainbow, which is sort of much more flashy and hubristic way to go. The analogy to this here is that I am very much trying to humbly, although maybe that's not coming across, follow my instincts in interpreting and talking about these dreams and their relevance. And yeah, I think as best as I can, I'm going to be trying to like, I'm not attempting to come across as an expert on Jung. I'm attempting to come across as someone honest, um, or someone who's been, yeah, really lit up by reading this text and feels inclined to share about that. And by doing so, I'm hoping to demonstrate the attitude which is implied by the dreams. The analogy to witnessing would be something like if we go too much up into our heads, and that's not the place that I'm hoping to connect from. I'm hoping to connect from a more, yeah, soulful place, a place that is more personable. Although I'm not very good at that. Well, in some way, but I'm not sure if this helps or not. But I want to continue through. I want to keep going. So, Dream 9 on page 132, a green land where many sheep are pastured. It's the land of sheep. Um, yeah, obviously the green land is connected with Eden. Sheep are sort of naive or unconscious in a sense. It's not a lamb, it's sheep. And so there's a connection here to the childlike state. So going back, so to Adam and Eve pre-fall. Um, I won't read what Jung says. And so Dream 10 goes, the unknown woman stands in the land of sheep and points the way. She was previously sitting, now she's standing, so she's taking more active, agentic, autonomous role in the process. Um, yeah, so Jung says the anima, having already anticipated the stultification in the previous dream, she anticipated what's going to happen as a messenger of the divine, let's say, now appears as the psychopomp, the guide, the one who shows the way. The way begins in the children's land, i.e., at a time when rational present-day consciousness was not yet separated from the historical psyche, the collective unconscious. The separation is indeed inevitable, but it leads to such an alienation from that dim psyche of the dawn of mankind that a loss of instinct ensues. We'll just finish it out. The result is instinctual atrophy and hence disorientation in everyday human situations, but it also follows from the separation that the children's land will remain definitely infantile and become a perpetual source of childish inclinations and impulses. These intrusions are naturally most unwelcome to the conscious mind, and it consistently represses them for that reason. But the very consistency of the repression only serves to bring about a still greater alienation from the fountainhead, thus increasing the lack of instinct until it becomes a lack of soul. As a result, the conscious mind is either completely swamped by childishness, or else constantly obliged to defend itself in vain against the inundation by means of cynical affectation of old age or embittered resignation. We must therefore realize that despite its undeniable successes, the rational attitude of present-day consciousness is, in many human respects, childishly unadapted and hostile to life. Life has grown desiccated and cramped, crying out for the rediscovery of the fountainhead. But the fountainhead can only be found if the conscious mind will suffer itself to be led back to the children's land, there to receive guidance from the unconscious as before. To remain a child too long is childish, but it is just as childish to move away and then assume that childhood no longer exists because we do not see it. But if we return to the children's land, we succumb to the fear of becoming childish because we do not understand that everything of psychic origin has a double face. One face looks forward, the other back. It is ambivalent and therefore symbolic, like all living reality. We stand on a peak of consciousness, believing in a childish way that the path leads upward to yet higher peaks beyond. That is the chimerical Rainbow Bridge. In order to reach the next peak, we must first go down into the land where the paths begin to divide. So I invite you to unpack that on your own, but there is a lot here that I wanted to mention. And so the unknown woman stands in the land of sheep and points the way. Um, I talked in the Red Book introduction about how Jung was called to reconnect with the feeling of his own childhood, and this is how he sort of got into building his tower at Bollingen on the Lake of Zurich. And basically, what's being implied here is that the there's a sense of in childhood there is sort of as you said mystical participation in the collective psyche, and there's a sort of this is the in a sense the origin of the of the ego identity of separation from the collective, and as Jung says at the beginning here, the separation is indeed inevitable, but it leads to an alienation. So this alienation is a sort of the fall from Eden into individuality. It leads to a sense of loneliness, a sense of isolation. That's contingent upon Dream 3, for example, with the island. This is the isolation of modern consciousness. Um, so in a way, Jung is also describing Jung is describing an early sense of separation, alienation from his own soul, his own anima, and an intrusion by that anima. And so he's describing that he's implying his own process. Yeah, so the connection here is that the way begins in the children's land. The children's land has this sort of affect of childhood, but it also has the affect of divinity, mystical participation in the ultimate or transcendent. And for Jung, this came in the form of the revelations of the Red Book. It was a time when his present scientific, psychological, rational, present day persona was not yet separated from his soul, as manifest in the revelations of the Red Book. That separation was inevitable for him to retain his sense of individuality, but it also led to um, a great deal of alienation. That's for Jung himself. More generally, as he said, the result is instinctual. The result of the individuation, the process of separation from the collective psyche in individual development, let's say, is a result is instinctual atrophy and hence disorientation in everyday human situations. And that means that sort of after accepting the call to adventure into individuality away from the community, one is at first cast adrift into individuality, onto one's own resources. One isn't sure where to go or what to do once one has decided to proceed into interacting with the unconscious, let's say, or whatever the hero's journey is going to be. It is actually a descent into individuality, and the result of which is instinctual atrophy, because connection with the community in this context, the beginning of the hero's journey looks like or is analogous to being connected with oneself, with one's instincts, knowing what to do, having the answers given to one. We lose that capacity when we have to rely on ourselves, who don't have the experience to know what to do. Yeah, it also follows from the separation that the children's land will remain definitely infantile and become a perpetual source of childish inclinations and impulses. which means it's both helpful and unhelpful. That has that's the divine son, the divine child archetype, pure eternus, who's both good and evil in that way. Childishness. It's the qualities of childishness that are helpful or not helpful. Yeah, and so the after in the course of individual development, when the maturity is developed, these intrusions by the childish spirit, if you like, then get repressed. But Jung's again here making this connection between individual development and collective development. So he's pointing back to the development of consciousness across the course of the species in his own terms, in his own views. And so he's saying that the sort of the repression with which modern consciousness sort of attains to cultural maturity in some sense involves a cutting off from the instincts, which can be exaggerated until it becomes the point of a lack of soul, meaning we get cut off from the mercurial fountain, the fountainhead of life, which is the reason that water in Dream 8 was the symbol of everything lowly. So it's the water as in the water of life is revivifying for that reason because it reconnects us with everything that is low, everything that is more instinctual or embodied or disgraceful, being repressed. Yeah, and so when we sort of restore that attitude, when we restore the state of childlikeness in adulthood by reconnecting with um, those qualities, the result can be that we are inundated by the material from the unconscious, which is quite dangerous. It can also be a symbol of regression, the myth of which is Peter Pan. So Peter Pan is the sort of like someone who then ended up staying in the children's land. So he sort of went back there because it's better there. It's more fun. And his model of adulthood is Captain Hook, and who wants to be like Captain Hook. So he doesn't proceed to um, follow the anima out of the children's land. He gets back there, but doesn't move onwards. And so this is sort of the dream is pointing the way forwards through the hero's journey. So it's from a state of childlikeness, but and that's from that place we can then evaluate present day rational consciousness, which Jung proceeds to do. So there's a way that is unadapted and hostile to life. So life has this quality of having like when we're overcultured, so let's say there's this kind of ossification, stagnation, petrification that happens in modern culture where people aren't alive, they're not in their bodies, they're not really living, not really connected with the source of life, with the source of with soul, let's say. And this is all being elaborated here. So it's like retaining the state of childlikeness, not as a permanent regression, but as a place to move forwards from that is sort of recommended by the soul, by the anima, as like how to move forwards in terms of individual and cultural development. Yeah, because we don't want to just be so that the fountainhead, the source of life, the source of the renewal of our own life, the renewal of the spring of life force can only be found if our conscious mind is willing to go back to the children's land and suffer guidance from the unconscious. And so we don't want to make the pre-trans fallacy by sort of going back only to stay there, like Peter Pan. It would be like that making a regression back to a childlike attitude would be a progression, but it's not. It's only a place to set out from again. So we don't want to stay like Peter Pan. That would be to make the pre-trans fallacy in the sense of um, confusing the like if we're in ego, this sort of pre-ego and post-ego, and the pre-trans fallacy is to confuse pre and trans ego. And so there's a oh we can move forwards by going back and then staying there, and it's like no, that's a pre-trans fallacy because we need to go back only to move forwards again would be the proper way to proceed. I recommend looking up the pre-trans fallacy if you don't know more about that already. Um, Yeah, so Jung sort of disclosing or confessing his own difficulty here as well in the end of his commentary on Dream 10, which is on page 134. And it's because he's saying that, but if we return to the children's land, we succumb to the fear of becoming childish because we do not understand that everything of psychic origin has a double face. And one of the undercurrents there is, but if I return to the children's land, I succumb to the fear of becoming childish. So Jung is sort of disclosing his reluctance to um, deepen and reify and realize his bond with his own soul. He's sort of defaulting to this, um, the persona of an analytical psychologist, which sort of realizes the stagnation in modern culture that he is pointing to. It's a difficulty for him to retain this childlike spontaneity, I'm going to say. Everything of psychic origin has a double face. One face looks forward, the other back. This has a meaning that shows up later, and importantly for the moment, it's a sort of the soul as a psychopomp or guide is a sort of the connection to the divine, and um, she's able to look back to the origins in the sense that um, if we look back through the origins, we look back to the progenitor, which is a way of accessing God. And so the soul can look back in that way toward God, but she can also look to the future and guide us toward that direction. So that's one sense of having a double face. Uh, one face looks forward and the other back. But there's also a forward and back in the sense of one face of the soul communicates to us, but the fact that she's autonomous, does her own thing, means that um, she's also facing God and involved with the unconscious in a way that we cannot understand. Yeah, and obviously the most important part to emphasize is that in terms of the progression through the narrative of the dreams, we're standing on a peak of consciousness and believing that like from the place of childhood we can sort of regain this anagogic ascent upwards. But the dream is sort of saying that we have to actually descend and go lower. Um, yeah, in order to reach the next peak, we must go down into the land where the paths begin to divide. Yeah, and yeah, so I just wanted to mention earlier that in connection with the ladder, so obviously figure 15 ends up being important, scalar lapidus, because it represents the stages of the alchemical process. And so we can put that in terms of seven stages, if you like. But the reason that seven is important there is because the stages of Neoplatonic ascent through levels of a spiritual hierarchy was connected with the planets, and of which stereotypically or paradigmatically there were seven. And so the association between seven and ascent came about through Neoplatonic ascent, through that model of spiritual development that is implied in the significance of the ladder, the significance of number seven, and of ascent and descent. That's going to be important in a second, and we can find out how. And now we're on page. Yeah, so dream 11 goes, a voice says, but you are still a child. This dream forces the dreamer to admit that even a highly differentiated consciousness is not by any means finished with childish things, and that a return to the world of childhood is necessary. So the dreamer can obviously refer to anyone that's present, and it sort of means that like no matter how much we overanalyze um, a particular series of dreams, we're not sort of there needs to be a quality of connection with this childlike state of connection with the source of life or with the soul as well that allows us to progress and move forwards. Um, to the degree that we can't access that, we're not able to move forwards. And um, it's basically revealing that Jung himself is in no way exempt from the unconscious processes and the forces and energies which he describes. And like he is actually their vessel. He is containing them. So the soul at this point is showing the way. And so the voice is essentially coming from, I mean, we can infer that it's coming from the anima, that doesn't really matter. And you're still a child refers to the Peter Pan-like state. Okay, move to Dream 12, which goes from page 136. A dangerous walk with mother and father up and down many ladders. So Jung says a childish consciousness is always tied to father and mother, and is never by itself. Return to childhood is always the return to father and mother, to the whole burden of the psychic non-ego as represented by the parents. With its long and momentous history, regression spells disintegration into our historical and hereditary determinants, and it's only with the greatest effort that we can free ourselves from their embrace. Our psychic prehistory is in truth the spirit of gravity, which needs steps and ladders because, unlike the disembodied airy intellect, it cannot fly at will. Disintegration into the jumble of historical determinants is like losing one's way, where even what is right seems an alarming mistake. Hint, as hinted above, the steps and ladders theme points to the process of psychic transformation with all its ups and downs. We find a classic example of this in Zosimus' Ascent and Descent of the 15 Steps of Light and Darkness. It is, of course, impossible to free oneself from one's childhood without devoting a great deal of work to it, as Freud's researchers have long since shown, nor can it be achieved through intellectual knowledge only. What is alone effective is a remembering that is also a re-experiencing. Amnesis. The swift passage of the years and the overwhelming inrush of the newly discovered world leave a mass of material behind that is never dealt with. We do not shake this off, we merely remove ourselves from it, so that when in later years we return to the memories of childhood, we find bits of our personality still alive, which cling round us and suffuse us with the feeling of earlier times. Being still in their childhood state, these fragments are very powerful in their effect. They can lose their infantile aspect and be corrected only when they are reunited with adult consciousness. This personal unconscious must always be dealt with first, that is, made conscious. Otherwise, the gateway to the collective unconscious cannot be opened. The journey with father and mother up and down many ladders represents the making conscious of infantile contents that have not yet been integrated. Yeah, so regarding Dream 12, one thing that will help us is to establish a bit more of a narrative in terms of progression through these dreams. So we sort of started to listen and talk to the anima after having escaped the um, rationalistic, paternalistic attitude of the father, or of, I don't know, the culture of Western consciousness, culture of the consciousness of Western culture that is present. And so this enables us to start dialoguing with the soul or anima, listening to her. And she's sort of saying, hey, you have to go back to childhood to make a start here. And so after that point, there's a sort of descent under the rainbow bridge to the state of childhood. And then there's a wanting to move on from that point. And the question is how to do that. And these dreams are describing a way not to do that, a way not to progress from the state of childhood, which is to say, the one proceeds with still under the influence of mother and father. So this is what Dream 11 is saying, but you're still a child. So the idea of returning to the Peter Pan-like state of childhood innocence and spontaneity is so that one can sort of return into the memories of childhood and reintegrate unprocessed material. But if one goes back into this childlike state or quality of reconnection with one's soul, reconnection with one's childhood memories, reconnection with the source of life, with the source of divinity that can come through being in this state. One of the risks is that one stays as a child and proceeds from that point as a child, which involves a non-development, uh, not properly individuating or developing oneself from the influence of one's parents or from a whole variety of contents, which is what then Dream 12 starts to talk about. So what are the consequences of that? And basically, it's saying that the passage the passage through the passage under the bridge, if you like, the passage onward through the series of dreams is being impeded by lingering childishness. Um, so obviously, as I said, the pure eterna, the symbol of the divine child, which we um, had from page 133. So because returning to the children's land, quote, will remain definitely infantile and become a perpetual source of childish inclinations and impulses. So there's something positive about that in this sense of spontaneity and soul and connection with the source of life. But there's also something impulsive and um, yeah, regressive and immature about that. And both qualities are present. And here we're trying to deal with the negative qualities of that state or that condition. Um, so the passage through is being impeded by lingering childishness. Thus, to proceed through the series of dreams, through the process of individual development, to proceed ultimately away from one's parents and into self-sufficiency and into maturity, one must first travel with one's parents, up and down, a process of ascent and descent, so that the childishness may be integrated and the onward journey resumed. And so this is what Dream 12 is symbolizing, this dangerous walk with father and mother. Father and mother being capitalized have their divine qualities. Up and down many ladders. So the up and down many ladders is sort of representing this process of anagogic ascent and descent, which is like a process of ongoing development. Um, what am I saying about it? Yeah, so it refers to obviously both pairs of parents. So what profane pairs of parents, like one's real mother and father, and the super personal or divine mother, capital M, and father, capital F. Um, so there's a way that sort of using Stan Grof and Chris Beisch, our sort of our relationships and classic Jungian stuff, like our relationships with our parents, sort of form the manifestation of a more divine or spiritual relationship between the divine child and the divine mother and the divine father. And it's both of those sets of relationships are present. So there's a sort of profane relationship between child and mother and father, and a sacred or spiritual relationship between uh, the divine child and the divine mother and the divine father. All that is going on. Um, what does Jung say? The steps and ladders theme points to the process of psychic transformation. Yeah, with all its ups and downs. This is a process of ongoing ascent and descent that represents the ongoing cycle of individual development, let's say. Yeah, ascent being connected with the light and descent being connected with darkness, and therefore we have a tendency to avoid that sort of thing. Um, just on what Jung is saying here about regression, regression spells disintegration into our historical and hereditary determinants. So basically, what this means is that, like, if we attain the step of returning to the qualities of childhood, this is also returning to the state of immaturity where we're relying on the spirit of the father or the spirit of the mother or one's real mother or father to guide one through life, which is why it's a disintegration into our historical and hereditary determinants. So it means a descent into getting pushed around and ordered around by the forces of life which are not in within our autonomous control. So it's not exercising our will, our ego at all, which is a kind of regression. It's only by effort that we free ourselves from their embrace. Which is why he says that our psychic prehistory is in truth the spirit of gravity. So it's sort of pulling us down and back into uh, toward the earth, yes, but also into childhood. Um, Psychic prehistory is in truth the spirit of gravity. So it has a quality of dragging down. it needs steps and ladders for development, okay? Because unlike the disembodied airy intellect, so this is um, so this is sort of talking about like the Jung is sort of implying here his model of the progressive development of collective consciousness in some way. So he has a sort of modern consciousness is the disembodied airy intellect, which is like rationality and has a distinctive modern tone, and it has this capacity to sort of fly at will. So it's sort of ungrounded, and this is sort of basic Jungian uh, diagnosis of what's wrong with the modern age is that we're very imbalanced in the sense of having an overemphasis on this disembodied, airy, rational intellect, which can fly at will, um, but it is ungrounded. It's gonna Yeah, the thread that I wanted to pull here is that when so the disembodied airy intellect has a quality of being able to fly at will. It can sort of our mind can sort of go where it chooses. We're sort of very willed or overdetermined in a sort of Nietzschean way by the will to power is a sort of also will of the rational, conscious, cultured Western mind. Um, Whereas if we look at, for example, there's a way that will is seemingly connected with arrogance or self-assertiveness, self-determination. This has a quality of ungroundedness associated with it. And if we look at the word humble, the etymology of humble comes from humus, 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 which means ground, and humil, meaning low. So to be humble is associated with ground and low. And there's connected with the word humble. And so having an attitude of more humility means being connected with everything that is lower down to the ground, more connected with our bodies. So there's a connection there between this sort of the willful intellect and arrogance and being up in the sky too high, sort of like Icarus or like Lucifer. Um, and so we're humbled by the spirit of our psychic prehistory, which is in truth the spirit of our gravity, which is a good thing. But we then have to progress through the dangerous walk with mother and father to um, reintegrate material from childhood, which is what Jung is going to talk about next. We're still on page 136 because there's a lot of content here. Yeah, he points to the basic psychotherapeutic trope, which is that it isn't, of course, so there's a way that obviously, as we've discussed, returning to this sort of state of childlikeness is a prerequisite for progressing forwards. But then we need to free oneself from the state of childhood dependency on one's mother and father by, in practical terms, um, reintegrating unprocessed material from childhood, which is why he says one can't free oneself from one's childhood without devoting a great deal of work to it, which is basically what Freud is sort of saying. The pathology of the nuclear family, for example, basically leaves everyone traumatized and hurt, and we have to do a bunch of inner child work and reparenting work in order to free ourselves from the constraints of the emotional constraints of childhood, which are still with us. And that can't be achieved through knowing about it. It can only be achieved through re-experiencing. Groff said, the experiencing of emotion is the funeral pyre of that emotion. So what's alone effective in liberating ourselves from the lingering influence of childhood is to experience a remembering and amnesis, recollection of what we've forgotten, which is basically allowing the traumatic material that has been stuck in our bodies to be re-experienced for the first time, which is partly why the return to the body, return to the state of childlikeness, is a humbling. It's a bring connected down to the ground or to everything that is low, because what that process also implies is a reconnection with the difficult emotional material that is connected with our childhood and stored literally in our bodies in energetic, physical, and emotional form. And the bringing back the maturity of an attitude of agapic love and safety to those inner child parts allows them to be freed and like re-experience the traumatic material can come up to the surface of consciousness and be felt for the first time because it wasn't able to be properly felt when it happened when we were small. That is what allows the the sort of dangerous walk with mother and father to proceed by the reintegration of material from childhood. Yeah, and so this is a sort of these are conditions. This is associated with the human condition because our passage through a swift passage through the years and the overwhelming inrush of newly discovered world leave a massive material behind which is never dealt with. So we have all this sort of lingering psychic material, which is just a product of existing as a human. It's not necessarily because anyone did anything wrong. So it's actually natural. So we're actually left with that as part of our natural condition or our fate or our human condition, our fallen state, if you will, is to receive this work that we have that we're asked to do if we wish to liberate ourselves from the conditions of our to succumb to our fate, to our natural fate, if you like, would be to not do the work that's associated with recovering or reliving our difficult experiences and then being liberated from them. So the connection with the liberating or Promethean quality of our consciousness is to have the intention to work through that stuff. Um, yeah, where the sort of the conditions of our life that we're sort of thrown into are associated with the earth, associated with being bound and constrained and restricted. It's associated with everything that's lower. Whereas this quality of having the intention to liberate ourselves with the transformative fire of consciousness, this sort of quality is coming from heaven. It's coming from the spiritual part rather than from the earthly part. This sort of distinction. Um, Yeah, and quite literally, so that in years later, when we return to the memories of childhood, we find bits of our personality still alive. And so there's a fragmenting. This is why it's a regression to childhood. There's a fragmenting that we discover of all these IFS terms, all these many parts that we find there waiting to be related with. That means that and they cling around us and suffuse us with the feeling of earlier times. So this is very much a regression back out of modernity, back into prehistory, let's say. And it also implies that our attitude towards these parts is critically important because if we don't have the right attitude, then they won't be able to release and open up to us. Um, Anything else to say here? Okay, I'm now going to move into Dream 13, which is rather complicated because this is where I get into a deeper analysis of Jung himself as a way of making our way through what follows. Um, Importantly, the end of Dream 12, Jung says, this personal unconscious must always be dealt with first, that is made conscious. Otherwise, the gateway to the collective unconscious cannot be opened. The journey with father and mother up and down many ladders represents the making conscious of infantile contents that have not yet been integrated. Um, what's important about that? Because in order to proceed further with the cycle of ascent and descent, which represents progress through these ongoing stages, um, we have to integrate the material of the personal unconscious, and Jung is sort of going to get in his own way by um, sort of Gnostic over-identification, Gnostic conflation with the father in the shadow. So the Gnosticism is essentially to view God as the demiurge, or like God is not someone that's very nice, and by yeah, he sort of allows his scholarly, rational attitude to sort of take the position of that, which is sort of getting in the way of progression for Jung, which is sort of anticipated by the dream. So, just to say that Jung is about to introduce an association between the process of ascent and the number seven, and this was actually I'm going to argue that this is a misinterpretation, or that seven doesn't necessarily imply ascent, it also implies descent, which is important. And the Jung is essentially, in his interpretation, going to fall prey to what the messages of the dream try to recommend that he avoid. So Jung is sort of doing the equivalent of going over the rainbow rather than under it. Um, Importantly, Jung's association with between ascent and seven um, is sort of anticipated by Dream 11. So Dream 11 chosen by Jung. Jung's chosen all these dreams to include. So Jung's also, this is a process that's describing Jung through this as well, and Jung's unconscious. And when in Dream 11 it says, a voice says, but you are still a child. This is pointing to the fact that Jung hasn't done the um, integration work that I just described, um, differentiating, connecting himself enough with the childlike qualities of his own soul. He's sort of too much under the sway of the rationalistic, paternalistic, and in fact, Gnostic, shadowy voice of the Father. And this is what leads to his mistaken association with between ascent and seven, which are revealed by Dream 11 as childishly inadequate because it says you're still a child, so we can't move forwards. It requires, as the dream, as we've already discussed, it requires humility and an orientation back towards descent. And so we're going to unpack this a little bit further. That was connected from Dream 11. And so now I'm going to take this paragraph by paragraph as we move forward. So Dream 13 goes, the father calls out anxiously. That is the seventh. During the walk over many ladders, some event has evidently taken place, which is spoken of as the seventh. Already, so I'm going to stop sentence by sentence and go through it. So the walk is referring to this ongoing process through the dreams, this ongoing ascent and descent over many ladders. The ladders were referred in Dream 12. Some event has evidently taken place, um, and that event is spoken of as the seventh. So the question is, what is that event which is spoken of as the seventh? Um, so I think that event is Dream 6. Why? Because it was in Dream 6 when the woman first appeared, um, who the father, as an embodiment of a very different spirit of wisdom, would be anxious about. And the stair was the original association. So anima, solificatio, seven, and ascent are all first mentioned in connection with Dream 6. So these qualities, to do with the anima, to do with seven, to do with ascent, and to do with solidification, all in Jung's interpretation, are all first mentioned in connection with Dream 6, which is the appearance of the anima or soul. So I'm arguing there that that is the event that has taken place, which is being spoken of as the seventh. Yep. And then what follows? So Jung says, in the language of initiation, seven stands for the highest stage of illumination and would therefore be the coveted goal of all desire. But it doesn't. So the connection with seven, I didn't mention earlier, but seven is connected, the number seven, the symbolism associated with seven is connected we can see in the index of practice of psychotherapy and in four archetypes on the topics of seven and the topics of Mercurius, that Seven is connected with Mercury or Mercurius, the sort of with living Quicksilver, who's a symbol of the Philosopher's Stone, who's essentially like the divine son, essentially. Um, he's also so there's a connection between Seven and Mercury, and there's a connection between Mercury and the Anthropos, which is sort of the divine man, the perfect man. And with the second coming of Christ, with the divine son, with the Philosopher's Stone, all of these are connected with Mercurius and with the number seven. Um, and so seven does, as Jung is correct to point out, stand for the highest stage of illumination, yes. Um, but it's also what is lowest. How do I move through this? It's quite difficult. But Jung here is making the connection between seven and the highest stage of illumination, which is the sort of the top of the ascent, the coveted goal of all desire. And he says, but to the conventional mind, the solificatio is an outlandish mystical idea bordering on madness. This is sort of like to the conventional mind or to the attitude of the father, say from the point of view of the father, the solificatio, represented by the anima, is an outlandish mystical idea bordering on madness. So sort of the where the seventh is connected to the highest stage of illumination, connected with the soul or anima, is regarded from the father or by the father as bordering on madness. So this is why the father has an anxious attitude towards the seventh. And Jung says, we assume that it was only in the dark ages of mystic superstition that people thought in such a nonsensical fashion, but that the lucid and hygienic mentality of our own enlightened days has long since outgrown such nebulous notions, So much so, indeed, that this particular kind of illumination is to be found nowadays only in a lunatic asylum. Yeah, so Jung is referring to his own process here. He's sort of saying, like, the revelations that came through his own soul, as per the Red Book, are sort of relegated to this notion of, oh, I might be insane or schizophrenic because of these illuminations. And when he says our own enlightened days, he's talking about his own enlightened days, in the sense that he's long since outgrown these revelations, and he's preferring to hold the attitude of the father, hold the attitude of the paternalistic, rationalistic, um, heady consciousness, modern ego consciousness instead. Um, so when he says we assume that it was only the Dark Ages, he's confessing that he assumes. So I'm saying that his assumption is wrong. He sort of, yeah, anyway, that's not as important. So moving on, he says, no wonder the father is scared and anxious, like a hen that has hatched out ducklings and is driven to despair by the aquatic proclivities of its young. This means a lot of different things. He sort of so when we take the father by the associations that I've already made, when we take the father to mean Jung, no wonder the father is scared and anxious. He's afraid that he won't be understood. So it's hard for him to believe that he could be understood. So he prefers to make the assumption that it's only in um, the dark ages of misty superstition that people could understand the illumination that might come through a connection with one's soul or anima. And so his fear of not being understood, his need to hold up a professional scientific persona is very much coming out. It's very difficult for Jung to believe that he could be understood, which would involve not making the assumption that it was only in the Dark Ages that one could legitimately have a relationship with mystical enlightenment through relationship with one's anima or soul. And so he's sort of pointing to his own, fear and anxiety of being put in a lunatic asylum because of what happened to him in his Red Book revelations. And he is then um, driven to despair by the aquatic proclivities of his young, in the sense of um, it's a sort of this is a sort of concerned warning that if we mm, no, I'll just say that it's a concerned warning and move on with that. So then he says, if this interpretation, he says, if this interpretation that the seventh represents the highest stage of illumination is correct, which is what's in question, it would mean, in principle, the process of integrating the personal unconscious was actually at an end. Thereafter, the collective unconscious would begin to open up, which would suffice to explain the anxiety the father felt as the representative of the traditional spirit. So, what we're saying instead is that um, the seventh does not represent the highest stage of illumination, or it does not only represent that, and that therefore the process of integrating the personal unconscious is not at an end, and it therefore does not suffice to explain the anxiety of the father, which is felt as a representative of the traditional spirit. So this the interpretation that's offered here by Jung is in fact to Jung reassuring because it reifies the position of his psychologizing in this sense. So it would be convenient for Jung if this interpretation were in fact correct. So I realize this has been extremely difficult to follow, and it's not really intended for anyone else to follow. It's intended for me to articulate it in a way that is at least understandable more to myself. Um, so we talked about this interpretation offered by Jung at the bottom of the first paragraph underneath Dream 13. We're now going into the second paragraph and elaborating on what follows. There's paragraph 84, which says, nevertheless, the return to the dim twilight of the unconscious does not mean that we should entirely abandon the precious acquisition of our forefathers, namely the intellectual differentiation of consciousness. First of all, this is a confession in the sense of does not mean that we should entirely abandon. Is also saying does not mean that I Jung can entirely abandon um, the ego because there's a way that the precious acquisition of our forefathers is in a way taking the place of Jung's ego in the analysis, which presented the interpretation that was offered just before. The connection mainly between seven and the top of the ascent or the illumination. Um, yeah, it's rather a question of the man taking the place of the intellect, not the man whom the dreamer imagines himself to be, but someone far more rounded and complete. So this is obviously a reference to the connection of the self, like the rounded and complete, obviously refer to the self. The man also in this context refers to the self. So he's referring to the process of the symbolism associated with the self and with the mandalas, which emerged through his Red Book revelations, actually taking the place of who he is and his sort of inability to live up to that divine calling. And so the intellect then took the place of that self in his life, in his psychologizing, in his analyzing. Um, but what he's talking about here is the sort of the um, what could actually happen, which is that the self, um, someone far more rounded and complete, or the man takes the place of the ego, becomes the new center of conscious life. That's what the whole process of individuation is about. Um, yeah, and that obviously shows up right here for us in the sense that the dreamer, as referred to keys one, two, and three, where the dreamer can refer to anyone who's subjectively present, subjective present consciousness. Um, so basically, what this would look like in our own phenomenological experience right here would be that um, there came to be a new center of egoic consciousness. So, for example, if imagine the phenomenology of the circle and it came to be present, the circle with a dot in the center, and it came to be present right here, it could refer to um, the entire horizon all around us, and then the device, the screen, being at the center of I. Um, so not who we imagine ourselves to be, but someone far more rounded and complete, sort of takes that place. Anyway, Jung goes on, this would mean assimilating all sorts of things into the sphere of his personality, which the dreamer still rejects as disagreeable or even impossible. That would be the task of the father. Sorry, the task of the dreamer. The father who calls out so anxiously, that is the seventh, is a psychic component of the dreamer himself, and the anxiety is therefore his own. Um, this is all confession. So the father being Jung is calling out anxiously, that is the seventh. Um, invoking seven from page 128 is a psychic component of Jung himself, and the anxiety is therefore Jung's own. That's all confession. And so the interpretation, anyone's interpretation, has to bear in mind the possibility that the seventh, um, saying this, talking about the seventh means not only a sort of culmination, but something rather ominous as well. Essentially, what this is saying is that Jung's interpretation, which we talked about above, is the equivalent of, is also the equivalent of saying that is the seventh, meaning that that is also what Jung is saying. That doesn't make sense at all. So how can I? Yeah. So his interpretation above of connecting, as he was saying earlier, if this interpretation that the seventh represents the highest stage of illumination, that interpretation is subject. It is a psychic component of coming from a psychic component of Jung, and the anxiety also refers to that. Jung's anxiety, that is, because he knows that it's not correct, unconsciously speaking. It goes on. We come across this theme, for instance, in the fairy tale of Tom Thumb and the Ogre. Tom Thumb is the youngest of seven brothers. Seven brothers. His dwarf-like stature and his cunning are harmless enough, yet he is the one who leads his brothers to the ogre's lair, thus proving his own dangerous double nature as a bringer of good and bad luck. In other words, what this is essentially saying is Tom Thumb is in Tom Thumb, someone small like a thumb, like this. So it's connected with the symbolism of dwarves, which comes up in the analysis of the Kabiri later on. So dwarves are going to show up a lot later. Um, they're sort of cunning, but also harmless and small, kind of out of the way. Um, and so yeah, so again, Jung is referring to himself. So you in the context of his own analysis, Jung here is small and supposedly out of the way, supposedly um, not involved in the interpretation or the analysis. But in fact, he's appearing from the point of view of his interpretation, he's appearing as being small and kind of out of the way and harmless and sort of setting himself up as sort of to the side of what's really going on. But in fact, he's the one who's leading the readers to the ogre's lair, which So the stuff about Tom Thumb and the ogre essentially is putting Jung in the position of that character and putting himself out of the way, which is sort of quite duplicitous on his part by his unconscious, let's say. Importantly, he was the first to invoke seven on page 128, which means that his invocation at that time and the subsequent interpretations, both there and here on page 128 and here on page 137, are both subject to the interpretation which is also here on page 137. Um, the, the trouble being that Jung's interpretation of seventh as highest is actually mistaken. Because the issue is that the seventh represents not just the higher stage of illumination, but also the way to higher illumination, which must always include descent, as we talked about. So Jung misses this by offering the interpretation that he gave, that the connection between seven and ascent. This reveals an infantile bias towards ascent on his part, which is okay. We're cool with that because he still points the way and he shares in the anxiety of the father toward that way, toward the seventh, toward the soul, toward the anima. He shares that anxiety from the point of view of his rationalistic, egoic, fatherly consciousness. And that anxiety, um, that anxiety is the anxiety refers to. So if I want to analyze Jung in this way, I have to explain the anxiety and explain the anxiety in the dream. And where have I done that? I'm just finding it. So Jung's interpretation of the seventh as referring to the highest is mistaken. So Jung basically needs to enact Dream 12. Dream 12 is referring to the walk up and down, and that essentially, and like the regression to childhood and reintegration of personal shadow material, which is what he talked about. Um, because he hasn't done that in Dream 13, the anxiety in the dream of the father is basically toward all which is conveyed by or symbolized by the seventh, which and the seventh, as we talked about, can mean sort of being at the lowest, being at the highest, being in the middle, and the process between them, because all of that is connected with Mercurius, right? And that means that the anxiety of the father is toward all that's conveyed by or symbolized by the seventh. So it's anxiety toward the highest, toward the lowest, and toward the way onwards. A good example of that kind of anxiety. This is sort of if you imagine it's the anxiety of any father. So a father is anxious um, because of like in relation to the child because the child moves forward, and so anywhere that the child moves forward to, whether that child is going up, going down, whatever they're up to, the father is anxious about that, sort of archetypally speaking. A good example of that in popular culture is in the book Children of Dune. I'm going to be referring to Dune throughout, Frank Herbert's Dune. So in the sequel, Children of Dune, Paul Atreides, the hero, has a lot of anxiety um, toward his son, Leto the Second, and his golden path, which Leto the Second is intent to follow. The anxiety of Paul in relation to his son's hero's journey is talked about here by Jung and is exemplified by Jung. Yes, so the issue with Jung's interpretation is that the seventh represents not just the highest stage of illumination, but also the way to that illumination, which must include descent, as we've talked about, beneath the rainbow. Yeah, Jung misses that, and that means that he shares the anxiety of the father toward that way, toward the seventh, toward the soul, and that's, of course, he shares that because um, the whole issue is that he didn't listen to his soul enough and didn't publish the Red Book enough. So of course he's going to be anxious towards the way that is pointed to by the anima. And that way, as per the line with the ducks, no wonder he said earlier on page 137, No wonder the father is meaning himself. No wonder I, Jung, am scared and anxious, like a hen that has hatched out ducklings and is driven to despair by the aquatic proclivities of its young. Um, because that basically the way that is implied by the seventh, by the anima, by the soul, necessarily includes those deeper aquatic proclivities. It requires deeper descent. It requires going down. It requires more humility. Um, and it requires more than that than Jung was able to find for himself, which is no wonder that he's anxious. As he said, no wonder the father's scared and anxious. This is all for the purpose of situating Jung and talking about this is a self-analysis of Jung. And so I've said here, so this is the bottom of 137 and going on. So about Tom Thumb. Tom Thumb's really going to be important later. It's sort of this inconspicuous, duplicitous, meaning good and bad, um, character. His dwarf-like stature and his cunning are harmless enough. Yet he is, meaning I, Jung am, the one who leads his readers, brothers, to the ogre's lair, thus proving his own dangerous double nature as a bringer of good luck and bad luck. In other words, he is also the ogre himself. So that is a confession. Jung is Tom Thumb in this context. Yeah, that line, he is also the ogre himself, also recalls page 113, which is the um I don't know, epigraph, what do you call that? And so that recalls easy is the descent to Avernus, night and day, the door of gloomy Dis stand open, where Jung is Dis, the ruler of the underworld, and the birds which pass over the surface. I mentioned this in the beta introduction, but according to tradition, all birds flying over the Lake Avernus, that is, which is in Greece, fall dead. Hence, its name was yeah, its name was transferred in Greek to as Birdless Lake, or translated as Birdless Lake. So the idea here would be that the Jung's anxiety and concern, the aquatic proclivities of the young, meaning the ducklings, to fly over the the sulfurous doorway to hell that Jung stands and guards. Yeah, seven gods of the planets in Hades is another connection to between Hades and Dis, and the seven gods shows up again in seven planets. This is traditional Greek mythology stuff. Um, that which is also connected to page 113, which is why I mentioned it there. And figure 20, importantly, because Jung says since olden times the seven have represented the seven gods of the planets. Greek gods, they mean. They form what the pyramid inscriptions call a Paut Neteru, a company of gods. Although a company is described as nine, it often proves to be not nine at all, but 10, and sometimes even more. Thus, Maspero tells us that the first and last members of a series can be added to or doubled without injury to the number nine. Um, that's going to be significant later on because the problem of basically seven is interchangeable with eight and three is interchangeable with four in a certain way. Nine and 10 here, notice that Dream 10 directly followed on from Dream 9. That was about the sheep in the pasture. They're sort of very much connected with each other. So this interchangeability between dreams 9 and 10, in a sense, they follow directly, which is what this passage is saying. Um, the first and last members of a series can be added to or doubled without injury to the number 9. Also, the planet Pluto can sort of be added on or taken off the planets without much going wrong with that. It's a very archetypal uh, quality. Um, Something of the sort happened to the classical parts of the Greco-Roman or Babylonian gods in the post-classical age, when the gods were degraded to demons and retired partly to the distant stars and partly to the metals inside the earth. That's quite interesting. So, when we sort of stopped believing in gods, they didn't disappear. They simply when we stop relating to them as persons, they sort of split, and half of them goes up into the qualities associated with planets, the seven planets, and part of them goes down, excuse me, into the Earth and is associated with the qualities associated with different metals. Um, I'm not going to go through the list of associations between metals and planets, the correspondence of the different seven here, but one can find that information pretty easily. It then transpired that Hermes or Mercurius possessed a double nature, being a chthonic god of revelation, and also the spirit of Quicksilver, for which reason he was represented as a hermaphrodite. Meaning, are we blessed by Jung or cursed? We don't know, both. Um, what follows here is that, following from figure 20, so which is the six planets united in the seventh. So there's a way that Mercury, or Hermes, if you like, but Mercury is, as I said earlier, the symbol of Mercurius, Quicksilver, the Philosopher's Stone, but also the second coming, the divine son, the Anthropos, the perfect human. It's all connected with seven and with Mercurius, so the seventh planet. And this is represented in the symbolism associated with figure 20, where the six planets are united in the seventh, they're united in the one, the divine son. And it's depicted that Mercury is here depicted as the Ouroboros, which is extremely important because and the red and white hermaphroditic double eagle. So that connects us back to figure 13, which was on page 127, which is the first place where the Ouroboros, as the prima materia, the initial stage of the alchemical process, is connected with the red and white rose. So the red um what's significant about that? Yeah, the red and white hermaphroditic double eagle in figure 20 is first, so that or the connection between the Ouroboros and the prima materia is first mentioned. The figure is on page 127, but it's first mentioned in page 128 in connection with the spellbinding circle, where the snake obviously is the symbol of the Ouroboros. And so the Ouroboros in figure 20 is first mentioned on page 128 in connection with the spellbinding circle, which we saw created the temenos, or sacred taboo space, from which the person was deeply connected with the divine Atman and Brahman. This implies that we're actually realizing the symbolism that was mentioned in page 128. So basically, it's the unacknowledged, unprocessed personal shadow material that, as I said, in connection with the symbolism of the snake, protects one by forming the temenos. It describes the sacred spellbinding circle around the center. And that is exactly what is happening, in the sense that Jung, by offering the misinterpretation of association between seven and ascent and not seven and descent, or seven and the way up and down, Jung is, by doing that, revealing his own shadow and identifying himself. So Jung is actually enacting the process of defending his personal ego from inundation by the collective unconscious. Jung is again enacting the drawing of the spellbinding circle by revealing the presence of his own shadow in what follows. And yeah, that is implied in figure 20. Anything else that I have to say on page 138 and 9? Let me just work that out. Yeah, I guess what's important about that is it's from out of the revealing of one's personal shadow that one can then communicate with the unconscious, or with the soul, with the anima, and then move forwards in the progress of the hero's journey, which is what was important about Jung's revealed bias, because Jung missed that the seventh, meaning the seventh, as we talked about, is connected with Mercury, and Mercury is duplicitous, as we've, in the sense of as Jung says at the bottom of page 137, he's the one who leads his brothers to the ogre's lair, thus proving his own dangerous double nature as a bringer of good luck and bad luck. So this duplicitous quality is a quality of Mercury is a quality of the Quicksilver, the Philosopher's Stone. It is good and evil at the same time, and that's partly why the seventh has to refer to both ascent and descent. It refers to both the highest and the lowest, and Jung's infantile bias toward ascent, which is revealed in his misinterpretation, um, points the way toward further reintegration of the personal shadow material. And it's currently in a good position at the moment because by revealing it, he's able to enact page 128, Dream 5, and defend himself, creating a temenos by which he can then communicate with the anima. And basically, what that would look like is a deeper descent. So the seventh can look like the descent and the ongoing way forward implied by Dream 12, a dangerous walk with mother and father up and down many ladders. Um, yeah. And so, yes, it then transpires that Hermes or Mercurius possessed a double nature, being a chthonic earthly god of revelation and also the spirit of Quicksilver, for which reason he was represented as a hermaphrodite. This is symbols of the self, what Jung called the self. As the planet Mercury, he's nearest to the sun. As the planet Mercury, yeah, he's nearest to the sun. Hence, he's preeminently related to gold. But as Quicksilver, he dissolves the gold and extinguishes its sun-like brilliance. So just to say briefly on that, that Mercury as nearest to the sun connects with the top of page 128, where yeah, it's the Mercury is nearest to the sun. So there's a sort of connection between, as I said, the snake or the shadow and shadow integration, and a connection to the Ouroboros serpent or the prima materia. Um, the sun is a symbol of divinity, say, so or transcendence. So there's a way that the mercurial quality is closest to what is divine or transcendent. That seems a bit obvious, hence he's preeminently related to gold. All through the Middle Ages, yeah, sort of this quicksilver in the sense of like by dissolving the gold, he sort of extinguishes its sun-like brilliance. It's sort of the sun-like brilliance would be associated with the descent, but as we discussed, the seven mercurial quality, the seventh, can be associated with ascent and descent, meaning that there's a way that the mercurial quality is beyond good and evil in Nietzschean terms. It's sort of not just associated with gold, but also associated with everything lowly. All through the Middle Ages, he was the object. This is page 140. He was the object, Mercury, that is, he was the object of much puzzled speculation on the part of the natural philosophers. Sometimes he was a ministering and helpful spirit, a Greek term, literally assistant or comrade, or familiaris, my familiar, meaning something like that. And sometimes the servus or servus fugitivus, the fugitive slave or stag. An elusive, deceptive, teasing goblin who drove the alchemist to despair and had many of his attributes in common with the devil. For instance, he is dragon, lion, evil, raven, eagle, raven, to mention only the most important of them. In the alchemical hierarchy of gods, Mercurius comes lowest as prima materia and highest as lapis philosophorum. The spiritus mercurialis is the alchemist's guide and their tempter. He is their good luck and their ruin. His dual nature enables him to be not only the seventh, but also the eighth on Olympus, who nobody thought of. Okay, there's quite a lot just there as well. So talking about the relationship in the Middle Ages, to Mercury, to Quicksilver, to the Philosopher's Stone, to the Divine Son, who has this duplicitous quality. He's hermaphroditic. He has a double nature. He's a chthonic, earthly god of revelation, but also the spirit of Quicksilver, high and low. And so sometimes he's to the alchemist, let's say in the Middle Ages, he was sometimes a ministering and helpful spirit, which is sort of equivalent to the Patronus in Harry Potter, and that's actually what like if you servus fugitivus or servus, the fugitive slave or stag being the Patronus of Harry Potter. Sometimes Mercury is this and that's also deeply connected with one's soul, is it not? In Harry Potter, there's such an obvious connection to make. That's why Rowling is such a genius. Anyway, sometimes he's a mysterious, ministering, and helpful spirit, but sometimes an elusive, deceptive, teasing goblin who drove the alchemists to despair, um, and connected to the devil in the sense that alchemy is connected with heresy and paganism rather than with Gnosticism. Yeah, so Gnosticism, alchemy as heretical, very much unorthodox rather than orthodox, meaning there's a sort of intimacy or familiarity in alchemy, in sort of connected with the Philosopher's Stone. Well, Philosopher's Stone and Mercury specifically has some of the qualities of uh, the Ouroboros, and qualities of the devil are included in that. It's not as one-sided um, the as the pedestalization, the orthodox pedestalization of Christ. In the alchemical hierarchy, Mercury comes lowest. Mercury, as we said, it's like about ascent and descent. So the seventh, the mercurial seventh, is both the highest and the lowest. Well, in terms of being the lowest can also mean first, the beginning, what's at the start. And so he's the first as prima materia, which we can see in figures 13 and 20. Um, Figure 13 is from the ones that I mentioned. So that's the tail-eating Ouroboros as the prima materia, the first material. So the Ouroboros is first or lowest, and uh, the first material in the alchemical process. That's page 127, and it's connected with Mercurius as the first matter, what's lowest. Um, but Mercurius is also what is highest in. Oh, sorry, we're also seeing figure 20. Yeah, same sort of symbolism. He's also the highest in terms of the Philosopher's Stone, which shows up a lot later. Um, Yeah, so at this the top of page 141 here, the mercurial spirit is a sort of guiding spirit of the alchemists, and it's Hermes Psychopomp. So Hermes is a guide of souls, but he's also the tempter of the alchemists. He is the good luck and the ruin, so he has this duplicitous quality again. So his dual nature enables him to be not only the seventh but also the eighth. We're going to explore this in a lot of detail later on, this problem of the seventh and eighth. Um, and that means that he is the eighth on Olympus whom nobody thought of. What does that mean? Oh, this later, originally there were seven Greek gods on Olympus. This later became 12. That's also obviously 7 days and 12 months is quite an interesting crossover there. So he was the seventh, and there were sort of seven Greek gods, and he was the sort of eighth god that nobody sort of thought of. He was sort of extra, sort of came along as well. Yeah, by that line, Jung is jumping forwards to page 232 when he refers to Goethe, but we're not going to go into that here. Just to say that Hermes or Mercury is associated with the number seven, and originally there were um, seven Olympian gods that were expanded in a um, by because they had some children and into 12 Olympian gods, and Hermes or Mercurius is associated with being the seventh, but his dual nature associates him with also with being the eighth. So there's a way that as a hermaphrodite, as like someone that has a dual nature, is duplicitous, he kind of has a dual personality, which this question of the seventh and eighth is going to be critically important later on, which is why Jung mentions it here. I'm just finishing the last paragraph from Dream 13, which is on page 141. Jung says, it may seem odd to the reader that anything as remote as medieval alchemy should have relevance here, but the black art is not nearly so remote as we think. Meaning that Jung is an alchemist, sorcerer, trickster, magician who is also present. Not nearly so remote as we think. It's right here. It's happening. For as an educated man, the dreamer must have read Faust, and Faust is an alchemical drama from beginning to end, although the educated man of today has only the haziest notion of this. Our conscious mind is far from understanding everything. Meaning there's a lot going on here which our conscious mind is not privy to. But the unconscious always keeps an eye on the age-old sacred things, however strange they may be, and reminds us of them at any suitable opportunity. Yeah, he's reminding us that he himself is deeply involved, as per the keys that I've mentioned. No doubt Faust affected our dreamer, or whoever's here, whoever's present, much as Goethe was affected when, as a young man in his Leipzig days, he studied Paracelsus. Um, it was then, as we certainly may assume, that the mysterious equivalence of 7 and 8 sunk deep into his soul, without his conscious mind ever unraveling the mystery. The following dream will show that this reminder of Faust is not out of place. I think this unconscious reference might be to like Jung later publishes on Paracelsus, and I think that it may be possible that um, Jung may have, as a young man, studied. I know that he studied Faust as a young person, but also he may have begun like in his younger years, sort of before he started engaging with the unconscious, really around 1911 and 1912, by which time he is already like born in 1875. So '05 makes him 30. So he's already sort of 35 or so by that point. And so by that point, he's already done a huge amount of study of Goethe, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and mythology, fantasy, and so on. And so studying Paracelsus may well be part of that. And so this may be a confession in that sense that um, it may be then that not only for Goethe in Faust, but also for Jung, that the significance of 7 and 8 sank deep into his soul, as in his own soul. Um, and that may be reflected in his later writing on Paracelsus. But that is speculative. That was published, that writing, in Alchemical Studies, which is a later work. Going into Dream 14, which goes, this is on page 141. The dreamer is in America looking for an employee with a pointed beard. They say that everybody has such an employee. And so this is going to get us into Faust and Mephistopheles. Basically, what we've ascertained so far is that um, the unintegration of the personal shadow is preventing the dreamer from proceeding through what follows by listening more deeply to his soul, and sort of actualizing a descent. So going into descending into the spirit of childhood and connecting with oneself allows one to reintegrate the shadow material. But if one doesn't, if one keeps this sort of um, rationalistic veneer of patriarchal consciousness, then one is going to be prevented from moving forward in that way. And the dreams, as represented by Dream 13, the anxiety of the father, are indicating that. Um, and 14 is an elaboration on this. So it goes, Jung goes, America is the land of practical, straightforward thinking, uncontaminated by European sophistication. The intellect would there be kept very sensibly as an employee. This naturally sounds like um, a crime against a sovereign ruler, and it might therefore be a serious matter. So it's consoling to know that everyone, as is the case in America, does the same. The man with the pointed beard is our time-honored Mephisto, whom Faust employed, and who was not permitted to triumph over him in the end, despite the fact that Faust had dared to descend into the dark chaos of the historical psyche and steep himself in the ever-changing seamy side of life that rose up out of that bubbling cauldron. That bubbling cauldron calls back the descent into Avernus from page 113, obviously. But yeah, it's an ideal state where the dreamer, whoever's present, is um, yeah, in America looking for an employee where the intellect would sort of be in its right place there, rather than having an opportunity to act out as Mephistopheles. They say that everybody has such an employee, which is reassuring because everybody has a shadow which gets in the way like that, because it's actually a protective function um, of the shadow, which is why it's consoling, as Jung says. Everybody, meaning everybody, including Jung. The pointed beard, employee with a pointed beard, is going to be significant later on. But moving on, from subsequent questions, it was discovered. Is there anything else to say there? It's sort of America is a land of practical, straightforward thinking. It's a sort of uncontaminated in a sense of like America is sort of representative of like how do we find the right attitude and just move on with this. Whereas the European sophistication that's present is sort of Jung very much getting in the way, um, and bringing Mephisto into the picture, Mephistopheles. From subsequent questions, it was discovered that the dreamer himself had recognized the figure of Mephistopheles in the man with the pointed beard. So there's a connection between the man with the pointed beard and Mephistopheles as a figure of the devil. And just to mention in passing, the figure 23, the mystic vessel where the two natures unite, Sol and Luna, and the Caduceus, to produce the Phileus Hermaphroditus. Hermes is the guide of souls, flanked by the six gods of the planets. This is the connection between like the dual nature of Mercurius, as the seventh, the uniting of the two different natures of sun and moon, of good and evil, in connection with the healing symbol of the Caduceus, the Hermes staff with the two snakes, to produce the divine son. Hermes is the guide of souls, flanked by the six gods. It's there's a bunch of significance to all of that, which seems quite obvious to me. That I don't know what to say about its significance. Anyway, moving on, we had at the top of page 143, versatility of mind as well as the inventive gift and scientific leanings are attributes of the astrological Mercurius. Hence, the man with the pointed beard represents the intellect, which is introduced by the dream as a real familiaris, an obliging if somewhat dangerous spirit. The intellect is thus degraded from the supreme position it once occupied and is put in the second rank, and at the same time branded as demonic. Demonic in the sense of like this, a good example of that, what is meant by demonic there is in Philip Pullman, Northern Lights, or the Golden Compass, as it came to be called in the Dark Materials trilogy. The daemon is like this animal figure, kind of like a permanent version of the Patronus, which sort of stays with the character and goes on with her through her adventures. This is and it's actually called the daemon, Daimon, not demonized, but although there is a connection in the sense that, like, from the point of view of the Orthodoxy, the Orthodox Church, it is demonic. Um, Anyway, it's the and this is sort of what shows up in Faust as well. Obviously, with the splitting off of Mephistopheles is it's a demonic character, and it's the employee with the pointed beard that is taking that position in this particular dream, Dream 14. Um, mm, yeah, and just to say that here we have the first association of Jung and Jung's shadow of the intellect as Mephistopheles or Lucifer. So yeah, the man in the pointed beard represents the intellect. So there's a connection here between Mephistopheles, the shadow, the man with the pointed beard, and the intellect, all of which are represented in Jung showing up as the scholar. It's introduced by the dream as a real familiaris, a real aid, um, which is a helping, obliging spirit. But if it is a somewhat dangerous spirit as well. Importantly, by the dream, it's put in the second rank. So the dream, importantly, is showing how to proceed. Um, it was this Luciferian, Mephistophelian quality of the intellect in Jung that was showing up as getting in the way earlier, because it was showing up as the spirit of the father, the um yeah, the in the Gnostic sense, as the demiurgical intellect, which is rationalistically present and getting in the way of Jung's progression by through listening to the soul. And the dream is showing how to proceed with that, which is to say that to put Mephistopheles in the second rank, at the same time branding it as demonic. Um, and he goes on, not that it had ever been anything but demonic. Only the dreamer, only himself, Jung, had not noticed before how possessed he was by the intellect. I can relate, uh, as the tacitly recognized supreme power. So basically, what this means is that after Dream 13, Jung is ousted as as an unreliable interpreter. So because of the gap in the interpretation that Jung offered in Dream 13, we can now recognize that he is not a divine figure and import the attitude that was implied back in um, pages 128 through 30, which was an attitude of um, an attitude of amiability, not overly deferential and not overly not overly humble, but not overly arrogant either. So listening and holding and valuing, but not showing up as a Jungian. So yeah, Jung is ousted as an unreliable interpreter, which is fine. Like everyone's an unreliable interpreter. And so because he's revealing his own psyche, right? That's okay. Um, and he says, now he has a chance to view this function, which till then had been the uncontested dominant of his psychic life at somewhat closer quarters. Well, might he exclaim with Faust. So that's what was inside the poodle. Mephistopheles is the diabolical aspect of every psychic function that's broken loose from the hierarchy of the total psyche and now enjoys independence and absolute power. But this aspect, and that's indicated in figure 36, which is from page 166, which is Lucifer. Yeah, the devil is aerial spirit and ungodly intellect. That's represented by Mephistopheles. And so 143. But this aspect can be perceived only when the function becomes a separate entity and is objectified or personified as in this dream, which is the function of the dream in the first place. Yeah, so the dream, so you could say that the dream, where everybody has such an employee in the dream, they say that everybody has such an employee that's actually in the dream. So you could say that the dream sort of reminded Jung of his own shadow, and hence these comments. So well might I exclaim with Faust. So that's what was inside the poodle. And it's obviously showing up with me as well in the sense that like I could maybe turn it down and try to be less analytical or reductive, and give less space for my own intellectual shadow and more to the duplicitous nature of the one of Mercurius, who's very elusive at this point. Amusingly enough, the man with the pointed beard also crops up in alchemical literature in one of the parabola contained in whatever that is, that's from Silbera, and has analyzed from a psychological point of view. Among the company of old white-bearded philosophers, there is a young man with a black pointed beard. A modern example of that is from Game of Thrones. Littlefinger in Game of Thrones is a perfect example of this sort of character. It's the sort of um, black pointed beard, someone who's like clean shaven, well groomed, but is like devilish right to the core, duplicitous. Um, yeah, among the company of old white bearded philosophers, there's a young man with a black pointed beard. This is a figure of the devil. Silver is uncertain whether he should assume this figure to be the devil. Yeah, so this is Mercury because this figure has a duplicitous quality about him, and this is also as Jung goes on, Mercurius as Quicksilver is an eminently suitable symbol for the fluid mobile intellect. Therefore, in alchemy, Mercurius is sometimes a spirit and sometimes water, the so-called aqua permanens, permanent water, which is none other than the argentum vivium, living silver. Yeah, the Quicksilver, living silver, Mercurius. Why? How is this connected with the devil? Well, um, the connection is that we know that Mercury has this double quality, because um, the hermaphroditic function of Mercury. So having both qualities, there's a duality quality about it. Mercurius, making him um, good and evil, ambiguous in his nature. And this is so Mercury is imp, devil, or trickster. So Mercury has these qualities. And importantly, these qualities are also connected with the devil, also connected with the man with the pointed beard, or with Mephistopheles. Um, but those qualities are then sort of condensed or personified in the shadow, but they only make up a half of Mercurius, who is duplicitous. And go on into Dream 15, which goes, the dreamer's mother. So we've moved on here. We've sort of come to the recognition of the presence of the shadow was interfering, and that we needed to make a deeper descent. So the anxiety of the father about the seventh was unnecessary and misplaced because we have to get away from the interpretation of the father, and that the shadow was sort of getting in the way. And Dream 14 expressed that because the employee, the pointed beard, Mephistopheles, the devil, the shadow, the Luciferian intellect, was put in its proper place because we all have such an employee. That allows the progress to move forwards, and that's how we get to Dream 15 and the dreamer's mother, who the dreamer's mother is pouring water from one basin to another. Um, Dreamer's mother is connected with Tao 20, Dao verse 20, as in Tao Te Ching, if that's not deadly obvious, which it should be. Um, which ends with all men settle down in their grooves. I alone am stubborn and remain outside, but wherein I'm most different from others is in knowing to take sustenance from my mother. So it's the archetypal um, mother as giver, mother as revivifying, mother as source, mother as creative, mother as vessel, mother as the source of the water of life, the living water. The dreamer's mother is pouring water, pouring the Tao, um, pouring the living water, the water of life, the living silver, the permanent water, aqua permanens argentum vivium. The dreamer's mother is pouring water from one basin into another. The basin is connected with the Pensieve from Harry Potter. It's this but also the mirror of Galadriel from Lord of the Rings. And so it's this basin, it's this like the flat reflective surface that can be a portal or a passage to dreams, visions, enlightenment, this sort of thing. Dreamer's mother is pouring water from one basin to another. Jung says, just briefly, that the dreamer only remembered in connection with Vision 28 of the next series that this basin belonged with his sister. So we come back to that circa page 248, which we will not get into here. So the dream goes on. This action, the dreamer's mother is pouring water from one basin into another. This action is performed with great solemnity. It's of the highest significance for the outside world. Then the dreamer is rejected by his father. Okay, so this first of all, um this action is performed with great solemnity. Yeah, as per this rejected by his father. This rejection stems from fear. Yes, so as per page 139, um, yeah, so we had earlier that the interpretation, the anxiety offered by the father, the anxiety that was coming from the father in Dream 13. Why? Why is the father always anxious? As in June, for example, like why is the father anxious toward the activities of the child? And I'm saying that that stems from fear. So if we remember the story of Osiris and like I'll give you an example to imagine. So imagine that you know the story of the Lion King. So Scar betrays Mufasa, who's killed. Simba is exiled, returns after maturing by reintegrating the spirit of his father, and faces Scar in single combat and is victorious. Imagine that Mufasa were present with Simba when Simba was preparing to take on Scar. From the point of view of Mufasa, imagine that Mufasa could be anxious or afraid that Simba could uh, enter into single combat with Scar. Why might that be the case? Well, it was the case because Mufasa was blind. Mufasa was defeated by Scar. So the father, by virtue, the father qua father, the father by virtue of being the father, is anxious or afraid in that context because he has an insecurity that comes from his own identity, his own capacity, his own limited capacity, his own blindness. This is why Jung. So this is an analogy where this is the reason, like it's the archetype of the father who's anxious or afraid of the activity of the son or the child, which the anxiety shows up archetypally in the dreams in Dream 13. That was page 137. And we saw that Jung shared that anxiety of the father, which is also the anxiety of Mephistopheles, by the way, but it doesn't matter at this point because and the solution to that was to not worry about the father and say, hey, we're going to be moving on. We're going to be doing the descent process that the father didn't want to do, and that the descent, which because the father was the interpretation that seven had to do with just the ascent, but because we can see, we can use the vision of the child to see more clearly. We can see that the seven is also associated with the descent, which is what the dreams were recommending, descent underneath the rainbow. Of course, the father's going to be anxious about that because the father can't see that that is the way. So the father's going to be afraid. And that is the stem of Jung's anxieties as per. No wonder the father is scared and anxious, like a hen that's hatched out ducklings and is driven to despair by the aquatic proclivities of its young. That's from page 137. So the aquatic proclivities would mean that um, from the point of view of the father, the child is sort of messing around in a descent which looks too dangerous, which looks um, yeah, unlikely to yield progress. Like that's just a bad thing to do. The analogy here, of course, is from the point of view of the rationalistic, paternalistic modern consciousness, listening to the soul and uh, writing the Red Book, for example, and the revelations, that looks like a very bad idea. So, of course, what we can see the follow through is that the dream is rejected by the father because the dreamer has taken the progress that came from listening to, or from externalizing, disidentifying with the shadow, with Mephistopheles, and that allows the dreamer to move on to the relationship with the mother, who's now pouring water from one basin to another. And so the father then performs a rejection. So that's how the rejection stems from the fear of the father. What else do I have here? Takes a lot of explaining, right? Tao 39 is connected with the Fountain of Life as the mercurial font. How is that connected? Let's find out. Yeah, Tao 39. Mhm. Tao 39 includes truly humility is the root from which greatness springs, and the high must be built upon the foundations of the low, on the foundation of the low. That is why barons and princes style themselves the helpless one, the little one, and the worthless one. Perhaps they too realize their dependence upon the lowly, which is exactly emulating the attitude of Tom Thumb, the small, inconspicuous um, ogre who either gets in the way or shows the way. Anyway, it's the lowly, it's the descent, it's the underneath. But it also says, this is Tao 39. Um, If the sky were not clear, it would be likely to fall to pieces. If the earth were not calm, it would be likely to burst into bits. If the spirits were not charged with mystical powers, they would be likely to cease from being. If the fountains were not full, they would be likely to dry up. I guess all I wanted to connect was the spirit of the fountain. Yeah, the fountains attained oneness and became full. It's the fullness of the fountains, their quality flowing, being full, full of water, full of the water of life, that is represented, for example, in a completely different tradition, the mercurial tradition, the alchemical tradition, in figure 25, which we see on page 145. We also have, yeah, the activities presided over by Mercurius. He does a lot of stuff, Mercurius. You know why that's important. So anyway, let's move on to Jung's commentary, which says, 145, once more we meet with the theme of exchange, which as per like that calls back to the exchange of hats in Dream 1. This is exchange from water of one basin to another. One basin into another is like one source into another source. So there's a new center essentially, which is going to be equivalent to the transition from ego to self. But once more we meet with the theme of exchange. One thing is put in the place of another. The father, yeah, this is exchange between father and mother as well as the guiding force. The father has been dealt with. Now begins the action of the mother Just as the father represents collective consciousness, the traditional spirit, so the mother stands for the collective unconscious, the source of the water of life. The maternal significance of the sealed source, the fons signatus, the fountain, the source fountain, as an attribute of the Virgin Mary. The maternal significance of the sealed source as an attribute of the Virgin Mary is connected, and the connection there is that the water of life is um, the water of life is equivalent to the maternal utero. So there's a, in the sense of the virgin birth, the virgin conception, it's the divine power of the womb of Mary that gives her gives sort of access to the immaculate conception. Like this is the idea that the Virgin Mary gave birth. Obviously, the question for the Christians is how did she give birth? Well, it's the divinity of the um, water of life, the maternal utero of Mary, which sort of gives her that power. The sealed source, fons signatus, a fountain sealed. This is from the Song of Songs. Um, yeah, so this is the water of life, quite literally, like the place of primogeniture, the place of origin, which is mythologized in um, the virgin birth. So the mother stands for the collective unconscious, which is sort of self-concealed, self-contained, is a sealed source, sealed fountain. That symbolic quality, which is like again equivalent to the Ouroboros. It's sort of self-propagating, self-generating, self-renewing, the source. Um, Modern example of that is Star Wars, A Phantom Menace. Um, this is the origins of Anakin Skywalker. He's like got all these midi-chlorians. He's like the divine child, and like there was no father. His mother can't explain what happened. If you've seen The Phantom Menace, that would make sense. Um, yeah, the mother is the representative of the collective unconscious, which is symbolized by the source of the water of life, in the sense that the Mary is in the position of the Great Mother, um, and she is in a way the source of the water of life, where the water of life is the maternal utero, the origin of the Immaculate Conception and the virgin birth. And so now the unconscious is altered, the locus of the life forces, thus indicating a change of attitude. What this means, as per the keys, is that the unconscious can refer to Jung, and this means that the altered the locus of the life forces, thus indicating a change of attitude. Basically, what this means is that, as we said, that the shadow has been personified and externalized, and that so it's saying that Jung's modified stance towards his intellect allows his own inner process to proceed, and for the dreamer as well. So, like, from our point of view, I can sort of refer to that by saying that there is something within me which is sort of newly conscious of my overly intellectual attitude, which is present, and recognizing that this is a manifestation of my self-protective shadow function, which wants to maintain my privacy by not allowing myself to be too revealing or get too close to anyone else who's present, and that I can sort of that's indicating a change of attitude. I can sort of take up that perspective a little bit more deliberately or consciously, even as I'm speaking. Like so, in the sense that maybe there is something in me which is wanting to speak through or beneath the intellectual layer of my presencing. In any case, for Jung and for the dreamer, the unconscious has altered the locus of the life forces, thus indicating a change of attitude and like the capacity to move forwards as represented by the mother, the symbol of the collective unconscious, pouring the water into a new basin, new locus of the life forces. So change of attitude by the externalization of the shadow. The dreamer's subsequent recollection enables us to see who is now the source of life. So this would allow me to say the dreamer's subsequent recollection. So as I just said there, it made a self-reference. So this is like the recollection of, oh, this is what's really going on. This recollection enables us being present, to see who is now the source of life. It is the sister. The sister being the source of life is the anima, the soul, and in very much I don't know if I can say that that's the source of my life, but it's certainly a significant part of what's been going on lately in the sense of my own soul encounter, which has been published, and that is part of what I'm hoping to talk about for sure. So it allows us certainly to see that that is part of what is going on here. Anima or soul as a sort of um, yeah, the root of gnosis or transformative experience, participatory knowing that is important in what follows. We're going to now move into page 147. The source of life, it is a sister. Obviously, this it is a sister. The new source of light. This is a symbol of the anima, symbol of the soul. But this is also obviously connected with chapter 2 of Psychology of the Transference, which is about the relationship with the soul, with the anima, and so the transference relationship. In June, in the June story, it's also connected with the as as the story moves from June to June Messiah, the first June novel to the second June novel, the main female influence on the hero, Paul Atreides, shifts from Jessica to Alia. So it shifts from his mother being the main feminine influence to his sister Alia being someone who is extremely important. I mentioned Alia rather than Chani because we're focusing on the sister here. And that was what it reminded me of. Yeah, obviously, figure 26, we have the Virgin Mary surrounded by her attributes. The quadrangular enclosed garden, which is a temenos. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that later. The round temple, tower gate, well, and fountain, palms and cypresses, trees of life, all feminine symbols. The temenos was from page 128. It's the divine circle. Similar qualities. Anyway, it goes on, page 147, that the mother is superior to the son, collective unconscious, but the sister is his equal. It's the sister being the soul. Thus, the deposition of the intellect frees the dreamer from the domination of the unconscious and hence from his infantile attitude. Just to say that I know that Viveki talks about the soul or the daemon as a divine double or a sacred second self, which means that in the terms of aspirational development process of moving from self one to self two in a ship of Theseus kind of way, like how do we do this higher development sort of thing? Well, the soul is very much not on an equal level to self one because it's in the position of self two, meaning we need an aspirational relationship with that second self. But here, there's a sort of the mother as a symbol of the collective unconscious is like very much superior, but like comparatively to the superiority of that relationship between the collective unconscious and the subjectively present ego, the sister is comparatively speaking equal. So in terms of the soul or anima being a representative of the collective unconscious, it's far more personable and relatable than the mother. And this is why I can say that the sister is the equal because it's comparatively speaking. Yeah, the deposition of the intellect, like pushing the intellect into the quality of Mephistopheles, frees the dreamer from the domination of the unconscious, and hence from his infantile attitude, which allows the progression from the childlike state of Peter Pan that we were talking about earlier. Yes, previously, that deposition of the intellect allowed access to the infantile because we needed to be more humble and access the childlike infantile state, which that was what happened in dreams 9 and 10. But now the answer is freedom from childhood by way of childhood. So we want to descend into, go down into, be humble and go into our childhood material, but then by way of that material, process that material and move forwards, move onwards out of the Peter Pan state, which is what's being talked about here, freedom from the infantile attitude after passing through it as a development stage of Freudian personal shadow integration, which is what's being described. Jung goes on, although the sister is a remnant of the past, we know definitely from later dreams that she was the carrier of the anima image. We may therefore assume that the transferring of the water of life to the sister really means that the mother has been replaced by the anima. Yeah, in the footnote, the mother is the first carrier of the anima image, which gives her a fascinating quality in the eyes of the son. It's then transferred via the sister and similar figures to the beloved, which is an extremely important developmental stage in the maturation of, in this case, masculine consciousness. Yeah, so this, this is what allows so the connection to individual development and so like if, in the individual development, firstly the mother is takes the soul image, and then the beloved, the romantic interest does, and then hopefully the projection is withdrawn, and that there can be a relationship established with one's own soul instead of anima projection upon the beloved, which is what allows Jung to assume that the transferring of the water of life to the sister really means that the mother has been replaced by the anima, which is extremely important and positive developmental change. The anima now becomes a life-giving factor. The anima was the veiled woman and the solidification, the son becoming woman in dreams 7 and 8, 6, 7, and 8. The anima now becomes a life-giving factor, a psychic reality which conflicts strongly with the world of the father, which is what the father was anxious about. Which of us could assert, without endangering his sanity, that he had accepted the guidance of the unconscious in the conduct of his life, assuming that anyone exists who could imagine what that would mean? So the thing is that Jung is the one who could assert that, but he doesn't because he's afraid for his sanity. He's afraid for his reputation as well. And fair enough, because the revelations in the Red Book are revelatory, prophetic, and who can stand behind them? He could, but he doesn't. Um, Anyone who could imagine it at all would certainly have no difficulty in understanding what a monstrous affront such an about face or turnabout would offer to the traditional spirit, especially to the spirit that is put on the earthly garment of the church. Hence Jung's Gnosticism. That's why Jung's a Gnostic, because of course, his um, adherence to his relationship, his ambivalent relationship with his own soul and the revelations that came through the Red Book, it's deeply heretical. It's deeply unorthodox. It's deeply not per the traditional spirit. So no wonder he's a Gnostic, you know. It was this subtle change of psychic standpoint that caused the old alchemists to resort to deliberate mystification, and that sponsored all kinds of heresies. Hence, it's only logical for the father to reject the dreamer. It amounts to nothing less than excommunication. Um, that's connected with dream 4. First, we must get away from father before we can listen to the vague female forms, the female forms that condense into the personification of the anima. And we did talk about the heretical qualities of the medieval alchemists earlier as well, in connection with the duplicitous nature of living silver Mercurius, the philosopher's stone, who's unorthodox and therefore heretical to worship because he has devilish qualities that the Orthodox Church would not approve of, and indeed, um, burn people at the stake for a lot. By acknowledging the reality of the psyche and making it a co-determining ethical factor in our lives, we offend. So Jung feels guilty. This is why he's a Gnostic. He feels guilty. He needs expiation. He needs to atone. This is Jung's whole thing. He's it's a identification with the transgressor, the deviant, and the shadow, which is why the professional persona, the intellect, is in the position of Mephistopheles, because it's transgressing. He as a psychologist is transgressing. And he's actually transgressing in two different directions. So falling into the intellectual, rationalistic, psychoanalyzing psychologist rather than a metaphysician, he's actually transgressing against the advice of his own soul, which is to stand behind the publication of the Red Book and his own revelations. So he's transgressing against his soul by falling into psychologizing rather than being a metaphysician and a prophet. So he's transgressing against his soul, but by falling into this in-between state where he's sort of talking about all this mystical stuff and talking about the soul and talking about this process of individuation, it's also heretical. It's also, heretical too, transgressive of traditional morality, like transgressive of Freud, transgressive against science, because there's all this mysticism. So it's actually transgressing in both directions. It amounts to nothing less than excommunication. He goes on, be it noted that the dreamer is a Roman Catholic. Um, by acknowledging the reality of the psyche and making it a co-determining ethical factor in our lives, we offend against the spirit of convention, which for centuries has regulated psychic life from outside by means of institutions, as well as by reason, none of which are available to Jung anymore. Good connection there is Alan Watts' Beyond Theology describes that in great detail. Regulated psychic life from outside by means of institutions. as well as by reason. Not that unreasoning, not that unreasoning instinct rebels of itself against firmly established order. By the strict logic of its own inner laws, it is itself of the firmest structure imaginable, unreasoning instinct, that is. And in addition, the creative foundation of all binding order. So he's referring to the Ouroboros as a symbol of like libido, symbol of creative life force, which is the origin of unreasoning instinct and life energy, symbolized in the Upanishads by the transcendent function that was in chapter 5 of Jung's Psychological Types, which showed up in part 4 of the analysis of zombies in Western culture. Anyway, this unreasoning instinct, this creative force, is of the firmest structure imaginable because the symbol of the Ouroboros is perfect. It's a circle. In addition, it's the creative foundation of all binding order. But just because this foundation is creative, all order which proceeds from it, even in its most divine form, is a phase, a stepping stone. Yeah, it's a creative foundation. This is the analogy to Dune would be Paul Atreides' second name is Usul, meaning base of the pillar. So there's this he as the hero is the base of the pillar, as he's the creative hero, like he's the art, he's a revolutionary, he's the source of creativity. Order proceeds from that. But because that foundation, the base of the pillar, because that foundation is creative, all order which proceeds from it, even in its most divine form, is a phase, a stepping stone, because it's the creative process which is regarded as being higher than. So despite appearances to the contrary, the establishment of order and the dissolution of what has been established are at bottom beyond human control, beyond egoic control, meaning, but also beyond human control in the sense that whatever is going to be guiding us forward is probably going to be coming from a layer of the collective unconscious, from the layer of, yeah, not because of our doing, in a sense. And we're going on into page 128. The secret is that only that which only that which can destroy itself is truly alive. That's from Nietzsche. It is well that these things are difficult to understand and thus enjoy a wholesome concealment, for weak heads are only too easily addled by them and thrown into confusion. He's saying it's well that I've disguised myself so that I'm concealed from your analysis and that you can't see me properly. From all these dangerous dogmas, whether ecclesiastical, philosophical, or scientific, offers effective protection, and looked at from a social point of view, excommunication is a necessary and useful consequence. Yeah, so this is like any dogma that you take up is going to be protection from having to work it out yourself and do it yourself. And they're sort of protective. All these isms, the dogmas are protective against the creative foundation, the source of life, which as the Ouroboros is like deeply transgressive and revelatory and powerful and instinctive and difficult to control. And therefore, from the social point of view, meaning that from the psychological health of the totality, excommunicating people that are doing that heretical, revelatory, mystical prophet thing is a very good idea because it immunizes the collective psyche against such heretics, against such heresy. Jung goes on, the water that the mother, the unconscious, pours into the basin belongs to the anima. Oh, sorry, the water that the mother, the unconscious, pours into the basin belonging to the anima is an excellent symbol for the living power of the psyche. Living power of the psyche. The obviously that's connected with Tao 8. Tao is the water of life. The highest form of goodness is like water. Water knows how to benefit all things without striving with them. Yeah, so water is the highest good. Water as the living principle, the water of life, but also particularly Tao 21, which goes, I should read it here a bit. So pours into the basin belonging to the anima is an excellent symbol for the living power of the psyche. The old alchemists never tired of devising new and expressive synonyms for this water. I'll read the Latin and then the English. They called it aqua nostra, mercurius vivus, argentum vivum, vinum ardens, aqua vitae, succus lunariae, and so on, by which they meant a living being not devoid of substance. as opposed to the rigid immateriality of mind in the abstract. And that all meant the old alchemists never tired of devising new and expressive synonyms for this water. They called it they called it our water, living mercury, living silver, burning wine, water of life, lunar juice, um, and so on, by which they meant a living being not devoid of substance, as opposed to the rigid immateriality of mind in the abstract. The expression succus lunariae, sap of the moon plant, or lunar juice, from Google Translate, sap of the moon plant, refers clearly enough to the nocturnal origin of the water. Also harks back to the aquatic proclivities on page 127, to the nocturnal origin of the water, and aqua nostra. Aqua nostra was our water, like like the living mercury to its earthliness. Yeah, so this water has a nocturnal origin and is connected to earthliness. Acetum fontis, or spring vinegar, is a powerful corrosive water that dissolves all created things, and at the same time leads to the most durable of all products, the mysterious lapis, the stone, the philosopher's stone. Yeah, this is all qualities of the water, the living water, the water of life that's being poured into the new um, basin belonging to the animal. It's a symbol of the living power of the psyche. Yeah, connected with Tao 21, which goes, it lies in the nature of grand virtue to follow the Tao and the Tao alone. Now, what is the Tao? It's something elusive and evasive, evasive and elusive. And yet it contains within itself a form, evasive, elusive and evasive. And yet it contains within itself a substance, shadowy and dim. Shadowy and dim as the nocturnal connection or part of it, and yet it contains within itself a core of vitality. The core of vitality is very real. It contains within itself an unfailing sincerity. It contains within itself an unfailing sincerity. Throughout the ages, its name has been preserved in order to recall the beginning of all things. How do I know the ways of all things at the beginning? By what is within me. Yeah, so this is the core of vitality, which is an excellent symbol of the living power of the psyche. Um, Yeah, it's the corrosive water, it's the dissolving water of the collective unconscious into which all creative products or forms um, from which they derive and to which they return. And from it, the most durable of all products comes, which is the mysterious lapis. A great analogy of this is the end of Harry Potter 6, the Half-Blood Prince, when there's the basin of water, which is hallucinogenic that Dumbledore has to consume. He sees the visions from the creative unconscious. He has to integrate his unprocessed shadow material in order to drain the basin, the basin of water, which is the powerful corrosive water that dissolves all created things. And what is revealed is the most durable of all products, which is the Horcrux at the bottom of the basin. So this is a very psychological trap for Voldemort to lay. Um, these analogies may seem very far-fetched, but let me refer the reader to Dreams 13 and 14 in the next section. That's page 191, which we're not going to go into now, where the water symbolism is taken up again. The importance of the action for the outside world, noted by the dreamer himself, points to the collective significance of the dream, as does the fact, which had a far-reaching influence on the conscious attitude of the dreamer, that is rejected by the father. So this is extremely significant. This is the first time that the so the quote "for the outside world" comes directly from the dream. That's from "for the outside world" comes from page 145 in the dream material. So the outside world, the external, the outside world, and the collective significance of the dream are connected. So there's sort of interior or inside, within, and individual, which are associated here by Jung, and the outside world and the collective, which are also associated here. This is the first time these are mentioned, the collective and external significance of the dreams. So outside and collective are directly linked. And it also it signifies as well the importance of the action for the outside world noted by the dreamer himself points to the collective significance of the dream, as does also the fact, which had a far-reaching influence on the conscious attitude of the dreamer, that he's rejected by the father. So it signifies the inner change, as we saw the rejection of the father was because the new authority was coming from The new source of authority, source of life, is the soul, the anima. And of course, the father rejects this because it signifies that one is off on one's own on the hero's journey, away from the protection of conventional religion and the away from the Orthodox Church and doing something heretical and for you agnostic. It signifies an inner change, an internal change. The locus of authority is now the source of life being the anima or the soul, and it signifies an internal change which may precede an outer change. It may precede an outer change in the sense of like Jung saying that like the establishment of the new form of the church. This is from the Revelations of the Red Book, which are published in The Way of What Is to Come, which is something that I wrote. This is extracted from the introduction to the Red Book. And the formation of the new church, which Jung Sol talks of, is established first of all in human relations, meaning that one first has to change one's attitude in one's human relations before the new church sort of comes about. And basically, what this implies is that the inner change sort of precedes the outer change in a certain way. It goes on, the saying extra ecclesiasum, ecclesiam nulla salus, outside the church, there's no salvation, rests on the knowledge that an institution is a safe and practical highway with a visible or definable goal, and that no paths or no goals can be found outside it. We must not underestimate the devastating effect of getting lost in the chaos, even if we know that it is the sine qua non of any regeneration of the spirit and the personality. I think Van Gogh said, it's convenient to walk on the road, but no flowers grow there, which is basically what this is talking about. Yeah, figure 27, life renewing influence of the conjoined sun and moon on the bath. And that arrives us at page 150.